Hi, everyone. Welcome and happy Earth Day. My name is Marwa Saim Abdu. I'm the National Outreach Manager at the DGC, the Directors Guild, and we are located in Toronto. And we acknowledge that it's the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Thank you all for being here today. We're excited to be presenting this panel called Waste Not the Art of Circular Design, Shifting Towards Sustainability. It's my pleasure to present Zena Harris. She will be the moderator today. She's also the co-founder, the founder of a Green Spar Group. So I'll let you take over from here, Zena, and enjoy the panel.
Sure. Hi. Thank you, Mara. And thank you to the DGC for having us all here. I'm Zena. I'm excited to talk about circularity in our industry with this wonderful panel. And so I wondered, just to kick it off, let's get to know you a bit. Who's all on the panel? Tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe something you're working on right now, or that you just worked on, and give us a little intro, and we'll go around to each of our panelists, and then we'll dive into what circularity is before we get into our group discussion. So let me kick it over to Marion. Why don't you start us off?
Okay, thanks. Thank you. My name is Marion Wehak. I'm a production designer based in Toronto, and I'm also the DGC's National Art Department rep, and I'm on the DGC's National Sustainability Committee, along with several other like-minded committees and conversations, trying to push the dial of sustainability in our pretty wasteful industry. So anyway, I'm happy to be here, and I'm really thrilled to be part of this conversation today. Thanks.
All right, Tiffany, over to you.
Hi there, my name is Tiffany Show. I'm a DGC director. I'm also the co-chair of the D&I Standing Committee, as well as your second vice chair at DGC Ontario. Happy to be here. I actually just wrapped up a show a few weeks ago called Wordsville, where I feel like they've done a phenomenal job on saving cost and saving on waste and actually, it's probably the first time where I've seen things that we've adopted from the pandemic over onto shoots today, where maybe we don't have the same types of restrictions, but because we could see the efficiency of it, as well as minimizing our waste, it's pretty incredible what we can do. So happy to be here.
Great, thanks. I'm sure we'll dive into that a little bit more in this conversation. I'll kick it over to Warren.
Hello, everybody. Warren Carr here. I'm a West Coast-based production manager, line producer. Been in the business for quite a while. I'm on the National Sustainability Committee. Many years ago, we kind of started some of this movement out here in Vancouver, right down to planting trees wherever we had shot because we trampled down a lot of things. It was interesting in my time period where we're getting involved with it, seeing how many people actually believed in what we're doing, and that there was a faction of deniers, climate deniers, which were gradually winning over here, of course. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I've done some circularity projects. My last project, which was for Disney, and we managed to come up with a red seal for our work in sustainability and climate management. So I'm pretty proud of that. And that's about it for me. Happy to answer lots of questions.
All right, thank you. Joe.
Yeah, hi, I'm Joe Madziak. I'm a construction coordinator with IATSE 873. I'm also a trustee with the union and chairperson of the construction committee. And I've been just working for a long time because I think surely our department has to be the worst for putting stuff in landfill. So we do these incredible sets, and I've just been trying to work for a while to keep those sets afterwards out of landfill and just keep using them and keep using them. And so that's why I'm excited to hear what other people have to say tonight.
Awesome. Daniel, your turn.
Hey, I'm Daniel Beckerman. I'm a producer and production manager and line producer and guess a few other things. I produced quite a few movies. I have a movie this year in competition in Cannes, which is exciting, about Donald Trump. That's a whole other story. Uh, but I also spent 14 years making a documentary about climate change, traveling the world to most of the climate conferences and interviewing, governmental, environment ministers and working with a lot of youth activists, including meeting Greta Thunberg before she was famous. And it's and I was also tree planter, by the way, Warren, for 4 years before I got into the film business. So I probably planted about 300 or 400,000 trees.
That's awesome.
Anyway, I think this is such a great thing to do because I think that the climate debate is being lost on a storytelling level, and we're storytellers. So I think we actually have quite a bit of responsibility to turn the tide here.
Totally agree. Can't wait to talk more about that. Scott.
Hi, I'm Scott Evans with Rocky Mountain Film Studios in Calgary. And yeah, just happy to be a part. Just trying to come up with new and innovative ways to change the industry, try to do things different, and yeah, just try and be better. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have all of you here and have your thoughts, your perspective, your experience come out as we have this conversation. One of the things that I find really interesting is that we all probably have done something cool, and the what tends to be lost is the stories, Daniel, stories about what we're doing. So this is all part of the purpose of this panel, I think, is to really bring those forth. So let's sort of set the stage then about what we're talking about, what circularity is, and then we can get into some of our experiences and whatnot. As you see on this slide, we're talking about the circular economy. This concept has been defined by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And it kind of takes the idea of the linear economy, which is kind of how we've been operating, not only in film and TV, but kind of as a whole in society, and rethinks how we use materials, how we create them, design them, and use them and reuse them over and over into a more of a circular model. So you can think about it as largely heavily weighted on design, designing materials that can be reused. And so when you think about you see the last bit here on the circular piece is recycling. So we always, talk about reusing and whatnot, and recycling is always kind of at the bottom of the list. So it shouldn't be necessarily the first thing we think about, but how do we design and reuse materials where we have very little recycling, where we have very little waste at the end that might go to a landfill? Um, so really putting the emphasis on the design side of the equation and use and reuse. And I think that's what the circular economy is really getting at here. So it's definitely a shift from business as usual in the linear world to more of a circle, more of a loop, and reusing materials. So we'll be talking about that here. Does that make sense? Are we all on the same page as we dive into our examples and whatnot? All right. All right. Good. 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 Thank you. And if you want any more information on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, I think we can put some information on that in the chat. And I will say, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We're happy to try and answer a few questions toward the end here. And if we don't get you to your question, I'm sure one of us will be able to follow up and get you an answer, direct you to someone who can get you an answer. So please feel free to do that as we go. All right. So that's kind of broadly what circularity is, but we have different perspectives here, people who work in different positions on production. So I want to ask you all, from your perspective, your position, what does circularity mean to you? How do you kind of interact with that concept on production? And maybe I will start with Warren and Daniel, and then Tiffany, and then get into the design construction piece. And then Scott will think about it from your perspective, from a facilities perspective. How about that?
Okay, great.
So
Great.
yeah.
I mean, it really starts off with an overview of what your production is and what they're going to build and what they're going to use, and interacting with the departments on how they're going to acquire that material and what volumes they're going to acquire that material in. And the specifics of some of the materials. I mean, you know, a lot of times it's a little bit easy to go to a plastic molded trim on a set. And it might be easy to go to a thrift store, or instead of going to the lockup where you probably have a whole bunch of things stored from your previous episodes or whatever. So I think conceptually, it is, you have to have a meeting of the minds of your departments when you go in from the very beginning on how you're going to do this. And of course, not everything's going to fit and be perfect, but from the very beginning, who comes on early? Production, locations, art department. And that's where that whole bit starts, as you create the conversation about design, acquisition, materials, and reuse. And I mean, one of the things that I found as a senior production manager in our business is that there's a lot of production people that actually don't look at set drawings and understand, you know, what that is. And as construction, as you will know, good construction coordinators are very integrated into that process and figuring out the materials that they need and where it can be used. I mean, the best use for circular design, of course, you've come across is in a series, TV series, because you're using pieces of sets, or you're recycling sets, or you're repainting, you're redecorating, you're doing. So that's it works. It always has worked to some degree in television series. In a one-off, it's a little more challenging, because where does it go after? I mean, I had a large production many years ago where we had 7 stages worth of materials, everything from plywood to steel to fake carpet to whatever. But it just happened that the studio had 3 other productions lined up after us, so we were lucky enough to move a lot of that onto other shows. The challenge there, which I don't think we have in place anywhere for the reuse within the same studio or same production company, is how do you share and record that monetization of those savings? You know, because that is a big piece. I mean, we sent on this one show multiple flat decks stacked high with 1/2 and 3/4 inch plywood. It went on to another show, but it was not well recorded as to what a difference it made to that next show. And I think now budgets are so tight, particularly in series, when you're moving pieces along, you're really kind of recovering where you might not have budgeted something properly, you know, or you need the money to make something else. So it's that aspect of it I find a bit challenging. And, you know, do we have the mechanism within set decorating and construction and the accounting department to actually tabulate that? And that's, I think, a piece of it where we need to show how good it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great point. That's a great point. Daniel, how do you think about circularity? How does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great concept and a great lens to look at the whole issue through. You know, I remember when I was doing more lower budget productions and music videos, there was this Canadian Tire in Toronto, an old decommissioned Canadian Tire. And I ended up shooting probably like a dozen music videos and like 4 or 5 feature films in this, you know, old Canadian Tire. And we just had all of these sets that we just kept reusing and repurposing. And whether it was just literally tearing it down and reusing the wood, or, painting the walls again. And, that was just, in that space, in that lower budget space, that was just sort of an obvious choice. And then you get into the bigger world of bigger budgets, but also more importantly, kind of, bigger companies you're working with that have their own ways of doing things, and they wouldn't really consider doing something like that. So for me, circularity is a lot about perspective. And like Warren was saying, making a plan uh, and designing an approach, you can do that better when you take a step back and you look at the big picture. You see the bird's eye view of all of these costs and all of the waste. And people don't do that very often. They don't take that step back because everything's so pressurized in the industry. But when you do, it's just an obvious choice. And also you can see then when you take that step back, you can see how it integrates into a bigger picture in the industry. And why would we be doing this? Who can help me do this? Who are all the interest groups that would have a stake in having more circularity? And that's where some of the design comes in too. I think it's industrial design, it's economic design. And what we need is to build a bit of a critical mass to put some practices in place, and likely to get some funding for facilitating some of the more ambitious aspects of it. And that means identifying all the people, institutions, governmental or private, that might have an interest in this. And once you get into that perspective, it's not that hard to see. There's a lot of people who would have interest in this. But we have to take that step back, and it's not going to happen with any individual or company doing it on their own. At least it's not going to happen in a sustainable way. So I think conversations like this are really great because we can bounce ideas off each other, and none of us have the whole picture yet. I'm confident of that. But I think we should, be having more of these conversations and save our notes and build on the conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I see Scott has his hand up to jump in. You want to add to that?
Hey Warren, great point of tracking, and this is more of a question because this is my first one I've been on with you guys. When we start tracking, used materials that one show's finished with, would that kind of go towards them of taking the time to actually figure out who else to pass it on to, or the next show that actually is willing to use used material?
Well, that's one of those gray areas, because the next show wants it for free. So they can, make those savings. The show that is losing it wants to get something for it, because in order to pull that apart, there's labor costs. So that's a piece where I think a broad cooperative network within each production community to discuss about who's wrapping, who's got what, that would help. But actually calculating that out, that's one of those areas where it's going to take some work.
We need to get into more of a practice of it, right?
Yeah.
What's coming off one show, what's going on to the other, what is the nature of that material going on to that next show? Is it reused? Is it new? That kind of thing. It's kind of like one show, like,
Oh, like there have been a lot of places here in Vancouver that are dedicated construction shops. So that construction shop can be, over the course of a decade, can work for 20 shows.
mhm.
So in some of those cases, all the tables that get built, all the saw tables that are built, And even inventory that gets left over just gets, generously left for the next group to come in and just pick up on it.
Mhm.
And that's, we've been doing that for a long time, but that kind of savings is minuscule compared to full-on set construction, but it helps. It's reusing and reusing
Mhm.
and repurposing. So,
But I do think you're right. I do think it needs to be tracked somehow, to continue to give the incentive so that people can see, what they're doing.
Right, right. Tiffany, I'm curious from your perspective. You mentioned learning lessons from the pandemic. I'm curious what circularity means to you and how you've kind of incorporated that into your
Well,
productions.
Well, it's funny because as like I come from a very strong, long line of documentary filmmaking, and so what that means, I feel like, is naturally being very resourceful with what you have. And I think that in the last 5 years now, going into some fiction work and seeing the amount of waste on set, I'm baffled often just because of the things that we, from my background, 15 plus years of doc, is we try to reuse and be resourceful whichever and however we can, just because we're working with such little budget. As Daniel mentioned, when resources are smaller, you can find creative ways of stretching that dollar and also not wanting to be wasteful. So in this like very natural way, before it became any sort of trend to be sustainable, we've been kind of had that mindset, decades ago, in terms of how we can yeah, save cost on and not have to buy new things, and also make use of and reuse certain things from various sets, to decorate for interviews and so on and so forth. And I think with the pandemic, as I mentioned to you, when we were talking, was that what we had learned was, or what we had were restricted in doing, was keeping our distance. And so how do we film in those situations, and how do we do this remotely? And that naturally, again, had to create these like creative ways of still being able to film, in a production sense of having a team, but do it safely and remotely. And so the first show I was on was for lockdown. I feel like maybe some folks, attendees were on that show, directing or worked on that production, but it was a sinking ship production, and lockdown was completely done online, and it was in partnership with YouTube as well. And it was an entire crime mystery show, done over Zoom. And these kids were also living in a pandemic as well, hence the title Lockdown. And they were doing this all remotely, and that would mean that there was no um, basically there was no sets. The sets were in all of the actors' own bedrooms. So their own production, their own like design was essentially their rooms, and with the help of an art director, trying to make use of the things that they actually had around, but also maybe things that we could send them and reuse to build up their room. And so that, I feel like that series has really, for me, had sparked a lot of thought around how we can actually be able to mobilize and do a lot of things remotely. And so when I was brought on to work on the Jane series, an Apple original series with Sinking Ship, and Jane series was inspired by Jane Goodall. So naturally, it was a very green, thought out series. And for my part, as the producer and director of all the doc elements that were embedded into the fiction show, we wanted to feature experts and basically anyone who had worked with these endangered animals. And for me, it was very, very important, as well as many people on the show, to make sure that we are showcasing and telling stories of local heroes, local experts, and people on the ground who, born and raised where the animals are endangered from, And I think, to your point, Daniel, around telling those stories, I think it's important to also, you know, bring the awareness that, these types of thinking and conscious thinking about sustainability and climate change, and who are the people working actively on this, aren't just folks in North America or Europe. It's folks, also on the grounds in Sri Lanka, in the Philippines, in China, and the Sumatran rainforest. And so it's really important to highlight those local heroes and to connect them to young people. So young people can not only see themselves on the screen, but also to show that, this is a global issue. And we all have to work together to be able to not only just save the animals, but really save our environment. And so to be able to showcase, and to film in 15 different countries, and this was still in partially still a bit during the pandemic as well. And so we had to again think about how do we do this and do this safely. And so we not only brought in the lockdown method where we built out these remote camera kits with laptop camera and to be able to ship these packages out so that everyone that we featured would be able to have an easy setup and do these interviews with them. It took a lot of coordination, a lot of time, and if we weren't able to ship out a package, we were then a lot of research to build out a local team that could safely be able to, again, film our subjects in these sometimes in remote places as well. I think, again, that taught us a lot of things. And I feel like also saved a lot on our carbon footprints if we had been flying around and, bringing a bunch of crew members as well. And it also, built and helped like the local economy and hiring local people to be part of this production as well, which I thought was also fantastic. And they were also able to connect with the issue at hand as well, which I think is very important. So from working on Jane and seeing Sinking Ship's next production, Wordsville, which, again, they adopted some of the same things that we used from Lockdown as well as from the Jane series. And so this new series that they just did, that I actually just directed on as well, used these remote kits, not because we needed to be distant at all, but because we thought that would actually be a cost efficient as well as just everything was compact. You don't need so much stuff, and I think the show produced still incredibly well. And I think there's a lot of savings from there, not just from like the budget perspective, but also in terms of uh, energy, as well as like a lot of the gear that we used on Jane was repurposed for this series as well. Um, and I think I'm not sure if everyone has seen this in the last like few years, like how it's almost like taboo to have like plastic water bottles on set, and that most of the catering is coming from like green sustainable like packaging and things like that. Has anyone seen that big difference in like no one prints slides anymore, only if it's requested, everything's gone pretty digital? Because I feel
Yep.
like that to me is that shift is when productions itself like are changing that culture around and not feeling or thinking that everything can be so disposable just because you may have the resources or money and you just want to do faster, quicker, now. So that's all positive and exciting things. Obviously there's still a lot more to do, and I think that, as Warren, you may have mentioned, it's like everyone needs to buy in on this, not just like a filmmaker or, production team, but producers as well. And especially, I think, the people who are holding the money bags, sometimes they need to put in a little bit more money to be able to see this through as well.
I had
Yeah.
an interesting experience with one of the majors not that long ago when I was budgeting, and I put in a sustainability coordinator and an assistant. And of course, as we get closer to production, the executives are going through, looking to cut. And guess what got cut? And, it was quite a tussle to get back in. Didn't get them both back in, but got one back in. And in the end, they were appreciative. Their studio was appreciative that we stuck to our guns because it made a difference.
Oh,
Because
that's great.
we recorded all the data, everything, fuel, electrical
Oh, that's
use, the use of
amazing.
batteries, all that kind of stuff.
I wish people had more like understanding of that cost as well. I feel like there's also a fear like, oh, we can't afford this, or what would that look like, or build that in and more knowledge around that. And I'm not sure also if you guys had experience of like even productions. I know Jane did this where there was like actual rewards, weekly rewards to the greenest person on set, which was quite fun. Again, any type of gaming or competition, I think that leads to some
Right, right.
sustainability is good. And I'm not sure if you guys experienced that on set recently.
there's all sorts of fun things that can be done, right? And I love your perspective, Tiffany, on, circularity, and that you're actually, you had to do it from a safety perspective and whatnot, from a, kit, uh assembly kit for shooting. But there's actually, like, that's a whole different kind of way of thinking about, using your material, using your equipment, and all as well. That's creativity at work right there. And it's just neat to hear you talk about it in that way. I feel like a lot of times we talk about circularity, as, where it comes to like Marion and Joe, where it's like, designing, production design, and the materials. So I'm curious, like, we've heard now a few different perspectives of circularity. And Marion, like, okay, we're talking about design here. That's your that's your department. How do you think about circularity?
Well, get to that in just a sec, but I just want to actually go back to what has already been said, that, yeah, it actually does have to be a real group project, a group approach. And I think normalizing sustainability is one of the main goals, is just like changing the paradigm so that people don't just go by route to the methodologies maybe they've used before, so that they're open to slightly adjusted things. But as you and I've spoken about, it's not brain surgery. So it actually is not that hard to actually make some shifts. And as a designer who's often worked on kind of eclectic, smaller, arty kind of films, not exclusively, but I have done a lot without big budgets, but I want a big look. So I've kind of, for like literally decades, gone to architectural finders and places like that, and kind of incorporated that into the design to make the design more interesting, because I couldn't afford to build it from scratch. And that goes from cabinetry to wall paneling, all that kind of stuff. So for me, it's just been kind of an approach to get a good look, and not without spending a lot of money, which I didn't have. But then it also became something that became more conscientiously about sustainability and less waste. And I have an example here, which I'd like to share. Some people on this panel might have already seen it, and it's been on the DGC Green website for a while. But going to your comment, I think it was Daniel said that, like, we can't, just one person can't do it, but I feel that we actually can a lot. A lot of us can still push it a little bit in our own departments. And I did a film in Winnipeg a few years ago, called Bed Rest. And I knew I'd already been on the National DGC Sustainability Committee and been having conversations such as this. And I thought, okay, this is a chance to kind of let's do it from the ground up. So, as my department got hired and stuff, we had a big meeting and said, okay, this is what we're going to do. I mean, I'm the one that said that, let's do this, but everyone was on board. The construction coordinator I had had been wanting to do that for years, but had never kind of been encouraged to do it. Anyway, everyone was on board. So basically we planned our exit at the outset, like before we even started designing, before we started like doing anything. It was like, we'd have to keep in mind that we have to get rid of this stuff at the end, because it was a one-shot film. It's a $12 million feature, and it wasn't going to be, it wasn't going to go into a series or another season or anything like that. So it was just an approach that we all embraced. And so whether it was the drafting became completely modular, and just as an example, like we were matching to an exterior location, and the windows, I think, were like maybe 3'7" wide. It was an old period house, but we just made them all 4 feet. You won't notice this on camera. So we just standardized the construction, the drawing of construction as much as possible. We rented things. We rented subfloor. So in fact, that's something, Scott, just to think about, perhaps in the future with your studios, maybe putting a subfloor in just off the bat might be great, because then other shows don't have to use it and pull it up and put it down. So anyways, there was a warehouse in Winnipeg where a producer had stored lots of things from previous shows, including stacks and stacks of subfloor. And so we rented it from him. And we rented many other things from him and bought things from secondhand stores. And anyway, if you just go through a few, we'll go back to the green goals and stuff, but I think the very first picture shows, anyway, here's the picture of the modular sets, which it just looks like a set. It's normal. We all build 4x8 flats, 4x10 flats, but we just kind of pushed it. So there were very few filler flats that had to go to landfill in the end. The very first picture kind of shows the big room that it was the main set, and the walls had to shake and all this kind of stuff. but again, from the outset, we just said, we are going to do this as sustainably as possible. And even like, as walls started going up, one of the carpenters knew he had another show to go on to. So he was already putting his name on many of the flats. And another example, just looking at the picture here, the roof, the ceiling panels were actually a 95% recycled material that we bought. Actually, it had to come from Ontario, but it was still cheaper than the local non-recycled material. And someone bought those as well from us. So trying to find suppliers that are also creating sustainable products is also important, whether it's paint or whether it's lumber, FSC lumber, or whether it's paper. You can, as designers and construction people, we can make that shift as well. You just go the next slide, wherever it shows the metrics, just kind of gives a little kind of impressive. This part here, a green goal is that one, the previous. Yeah. So again, the main criteria was use modular circular design. That was all right from the outset. We were all embracing that. We designed for the disassembly. So the construction coordinator said, okay, we'll use screws as much as possible rather than glue to glue things together. I understand, and Joe will probably tell you that you can't always avoid glue, but we did as much as possible. So that disassembly, yes, it took a bit of time, but it didn't take, things didn't have to get shredded into bits to disassemble them. We did rely on some sustainable supplies and suppliers, and we didn't even really think about single-use products. It wasn't germane to what our project was. But the fabulous thing was, look at the green outcomes. We had 60% recovery of our materials and assets for reuse. So that was either because another show bought the flats, or we just gave them. Again, it's like part of it's the money-making thing, but if you look at the bottom line, we could save money. And we also had a 30% reduction of the typical bins and tipping fees. So that's a savings right there. And we actually made about $5,000 in cash because of people buying things. And the producer, Cal Irving in Winnipeg, who has the warehouse, we did a bit of barter with him. So the things we rented from him, he maybe got stuff back from our show as an exchange. But there was an overall savings in manpower and materials. And the producer, or the line producer on the show, was a man from LA, and he'd done huge shows like Jurassic Park, like really major American shows. And he was doing a smaller independent film with some friends who had the company. And I went to him at the start of the project and just said, "This is what I'd like to do." And he goes, "I don't care as long as it doesn't cost me more money." And it didn't. We ultimately kind of saved a bit of money. So the point being, if you put your minds to it, it didn't take all that much more prep, if any, because I went in with this in my mind, and we all kind of had a meeting in the art department. Everyone was on board, and we just proceeded accordingly. And I just think it's not brain surgery. If I can do it, like anyone could do it. There's a lot of smarter people than me out there in the business. I just have a lot of hope that this can shift. So that's kind of my little blurb. And I think case studies are a helpful thing, because it's kind of it's almost a tactile example of what one can achieve, even if you're on a project. So that's kind of what I
Yeah.
have. Yeah.
And I love the dialogue that you had with others too. Like, this is, what I want to do. What do you think? Like, how, is this going to work? So it seems like, this is something that, this kind of dialogue, you just basically laid the foundation, laid the pathway, like gave people the words
I did.
basically
Yeah, I
to,
mean, and they were on board. Thankfully, they were on board. I mean, again, like you have to have them want to do it, and they did. So that was really good. I mean, and I found that especially the younger people in the art department were really keen about it, and I think a fairly good barometer to show where things could go. And then the construction coordinator was a very seasoned person from the business, but he'd been dying to do something sustainable for years. Partially, maybe he came from theater. He'd worked in theater, where again, like it was an economy built into the system and into the ecology. So perhaps that's why. But anyways, it was really a positive experience, and a positive proof that this can be done and achieved. So I'm just hoping that this kind of thing becomes more commonplace.
yeah. And Joe, we haven't heard from you yet. I mean, you're the guy out there building the sets so can you talk a little bit about your interaction with the production design folks, art, building, what do you think about? How do you reuse?
Yeah. Yeah. So not am I only the guy out there building. I'm the guy out there that's accounting for most of the landfill in this industry. And I, so I've always been, first off, I've done, as Warren said, series work is a little easier to do this because you're really trying to work on stuff. But so I've done a lot of series, but I also came from low budget theater, like summer stock theater, where you had to use what you had last year or from pull from what you had last year. But even with that, I was shocked when I went back and looked. I did a fairly ambitious series. I don't want to mention names, but it was a fairly series with a good number of episodes. And I worked in conjunction with my disposal company, and I figured I sent somewhere between 150 to 160 tons to landfill on just that one show. So stop and think about that. When I know 2 years ago before the strike, just IATSE alone had 39 shows in Toronto. So just stop and think about that. So that's when I really started to get better at it. And so the next show, with a cooperative designer, we weren't in the sense of what Marion's talking about, building for the exit, but we were trying to build with modularity. And by modular, I know some people that they may come on their mind, they're going to think like when you buy some modular business dividers or something, and you're seeing the seams of that. It's just a way, by building modular, it's a way of, by jogging a few walls here or there, or just creating some outs, shall I say, so that you can take that wall, move it over there, or you could take that wall out totally and put in new windows. It's just moving things around. So you're using the base part of your set. It's maybe having a ceiling that floats just like a ½ inch above the set. No one's going to notice it. And that's ceiling. And so you can pull walls out and change things around. We did this on Suits a lot. We used that same ceiling. Now, we had an added advantage with Suits. We knew it was going to be lawyers' offices or something like that. But still, we were able to put in many, many sets while she's got some of them up. That ceiling that you see, you can change it around. We could change where the lights go. We could change a lot. And that ceiling, oh my God, it was up for 2 seasons at least, and just all the walls around. And you'll see in the one Billow office, we had some hero flats that you can see them staggered. They were material covered. And you take those same flats and reuse them elsewhere in just different configurations, not on that angle lot, and no one's going to notice. I used to think that you couldn't use iconic pieces over again, but I'm convinced that you can. And so anyways, the next show, by just trying to, with a cooperative designer and a bit of storage space, all I had was 2 of those 40-foot storage containers. I got it down to somewhere between 90 to, it was under 100. That was 90 to somewhere between 90 to 100,000 tons. Okay. So, sorry, 90 to 100 tons. I mean, okay. So I got quite a bit off of that. So, and that just shows that's almost, I would say, a minimal effort. And I feel, Warren, you spoke about that the people taking the sets down, I don't want to incur the cost of sending them up. But I think I can make a business case. I think Marion has sent me a template. I'm going to work on this on my next show. But when we strike something, we don't just walk it straight into the bin. Most of the time, you've got someone smashing it up or sawzalling it up into smaller pieces so that you can put it in the bin. So you're saving on that labor. If you're going to get in a truck, you're saving on the tipping fees. We sent, when we struck Glamorous, it was in the middle of both the writers and the actors strike were going on. So there's no shows. I couldn't pass it on to anybody, but the designer that had done Glamorous with me was doing Matlock in LA. So I know it's not ideal shipping stuff to LA, but in just 2 carefully packed trucks, we sent about $300,000 worth of goods to him. and save
Right.
them about $300,000. And that's taking off about the extra 30,000 that it costs us to ship. So I do believe that I can make a business case for this, and I intend to do that. Marion's helping me in my next show with the template.
Jump
The,
in there, Marion
I just
or
wanted to,
Warren.
Joe, that the picture of the four images, that's why, because I've seen it before, but but if it wasn't clear, all of those four sets were all from the same assets. Is that correct? Same set?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, with maybe a minimal change here
Yeah,
and
so I
there,
thought that was remarkable.
but
You got four completely different.
yeah, those four sets. And then often what we would do, if we had material on flats, we would take that off if it became too recognizable, give it to Liesel, who was the set decorator, and she could do cushions for it or upholstery, use it for upholstery on chairs, and no one's going to notice. So we tended to reuse the fabric that way as well.
Warren, did you have something to add in there?
Yeah, I've done that too, where we've had to pack up sets and send them to LA. And it did work quite well, like 3 or 4 40-footers, it worked quite well. You had to get over some union politics because, the IA people tended to stamp their sets with the IA logo here, and then the IA guys down there were feeling like they were losing some work, which happens. The thing that I've been always is curious about that is how, if that show that you sent all the stuff to had a previously established construction budget, how did those savings reflect in terms of cutting that budget because you sent down stuff that is causing them savings? And that's what I was talking about earlier.
Yeah,
It doesn't
right.
always get reflected.
I agree.
And the other thing is, even if you're not paying for the materials or getting paid for giving the materials, you are going to make savings, which also can be tracked in just the labor of building the flats. Because you're sending down 200 flats, look at the labor you're saving. Because you don't have to build them. One of the things that we ran into out here, I don't know if you were aware of it, but several years ago, like 6-8 years ago, we had the pine beetle infestation in the interior of British Columbia. And so wood had to be harvested before if the pine beetle was in the pine trees too much, it would literally turn to cornflakes. You could push a tree over. But if you got the wood harvested early, we were able to make, or the mills were able to make 1x4, 1x2, all that kind of stuff from what we call denim wood. And that did get into our system, but it was quite a bit more expensive because it was being trucked in from way up north. And we really tried to incorporate that because it meant trees that had to be cut down were being used, not trees that were cut down to be used.
Mm-hmm.
So, those kinds of things do come up. I want to mention one more thing about circularity, and there's another way with our community, within not our film community, but within the community that we're in, especially for the one-off shows, being aware of the theater companies and the schools and all of those groups where if you don't have anywhere to put the stuff, don't bin it until you can create an awareness of what is needed in the community, because every school and every theater group around is scrambling for stuff. So it's just a piece.
I did a film in Sault Ste. Marie after the one I just talked about, and it was much smaller, but I got free flats. I got something like 60 feet of flats for free from another show that was getting rid of them. That was kind of a Facebook ad hoc kind of exchange of information. But then, the local theater company took those when we were done with them. My question about that, though, and it's a great idea, of course, to pass on things to someone who needs them, whether it's a school or whether it's another film or whatever. And you can't, none of these things don't have tags on them, but what happens to them after that next use? So in a way that goes back to we have to change the kind of thinking, the ecology, so that it doesn't just get used one more time. It goes in perpetuity.
Yeah, agreed.
That's the ideal, right? So
Yeah.
if someone needs it for their student film, or the grade school needs it for their little graduation ceremony, whatever it is, do they understand that it's their responsibility by getting the free stuff, pass it forward kind of thing, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Tiffany, curious what your hands up.
Well, no, just because Joe's numbers like were quite staggering, quite staggering
Yeah.
on the tons, and I was just like, well, like it's if there was ever in thinking about how many shows we have, annually in our country, in Ontario alone, and wondering whether or not there is maybe already a tax incentive related to like how less of like stuff you bring to the wasteland. You know what I mean? Like it's been weighed out, like it's based on like you can get money back if you've like gone under or something like that, where it's incentivizes, I think, just more around like the, the cost of production, to actually put effort and money, or just to be able to focus on that being an issue, not just waiting till the show ends and having this already built in plan prior to, if there was more tax incentives. I think about that because, when you're applying for like film grants from Telefilm, they're constantly, now we're seeing more like sustainability plan built into your film, not just your have a marketing plan. Now we want to see what your sustainability plan is, not just your, DNI, how are you going to do your outreach? They want to see now that sustainability plan to see whether or not this whole, if granting you money from the government, um, what will that look like? Are you consciously thinking about these things? But I think for shows that come up here from the US and so on and so forth, I feel like, everyone wants to shoot here because we have a great tax, incentive stuff here, but I don't know if we're utilizing enough in a way where we're having people think about these things, and to what Joe was describing, seems like there is a way of measuring it in a very tactile way. That's the right word to use, Maybe there
Yeah.
is something already in place I just don't know about. Joe, is there something like that already in place where people measuring garbage from sets?
Not that I know of. Not that I know. No.
What is happening is, and it'll get mentioned later on today, there's a carbon footprint is going to be immeasurable too, right? And actually it's part of this whole Waste Not initiative, not this webinar, but DGC National Sustainability Committee is creating a materials carbon calculator, which we won't spend time talking about now, but that will help track the carbon. So, because that along with all the other kind of metrics that Joe was referring to are, you're right, important things for productions to be responsible for. So.
Yeah. And I want to bring Scott into this more. I mean, Scott, you're from more of a facilities perspective. Do you have insight into this this kind of challenge that's been mentioned about storing materials or opportunities for holding while other pieces are reused? What are your thoughts on circularity from a facilities perspective?
Storing, depending on what your real estate costs are, can be, super costly when you start looking at square foot of and the cost of, what is the cost to rebuild something and how much are you actually paying for it. So when you start looking at the numbers usually don't add up. The sustainability part of, and all of us doing our part, that's a different point of view than actually just looking at the numbers. Very rarely do the numbers make sense, which is, where I got into, and I'm 80% of the way through developing this new, aluminum set wall, that, it doesn't take care of everything, but it helps. It's a key system that the aluminum panels interlock together with a special key. And then all you're doing is putting the banana board, that's usually stapled, to the 1x4s, is actually, it's a click system that goes on the front of it. And then and then you would go ahead and build your set as usual. But I did a demonstration of, just took a standard 12x12. I think it was actually 14x14 lawyer's office that all had beautiful wood paneling, and dressed it all. I had dressers dress it with a desk and shelves and books and plants and all that kind of thing. And then they went ahead and swapped it out into a full hospital room with took all the wood panels off, put white panels on. It had the gas, air, all that kind of stuff. The desks, everything came out. The hospital beds went in. Did a full exchange from a lawyer's set into a hospital room in just under 14 minutes. And it's not only a cost for the standard sets, you can store all that because you're not storing big stuff anymore. It's super, super small because it all clicks together. And then you're not only storing just the panels, but your aluminum pieces that you're actually storing are last forever, and it's a rentable product. So is it a cost saving to production? I don't know if I'm there yet as far as getting that figured out, whether there's a cost saving involved, but sustainability wise, it sure is doing our part from all of it ending up in bins. So
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, going back to your question though, because like it seems like you're at I've not been to Rocky Mountain Studios, but I've seen pictures of it, and there's like 2 or 3 buildings or something in Calgary, and with lots of space around them. So I'm just wondering, like, is that an option? Going back to the ideas that have started getting floated a bit about a space where that interstitial world where flats and risers and windows and stuff can be stored as one show, in that time between one show and another. That's something that, as developing a studio is something you could think about. Like I heard you when you said that
yeah, for sure.
add up,
Yeah.
but isn't that part of what kind of the shifting paradigm would be about, is considering that kind of shift where
Yeah.
it can be stored, or like going, like it was when I mentioned about the subfloor idea. It was actually Clara George that it was her idea that, wow, if someone was opening a studio and they put the subfloor in, because most shows don't want the concrete, they want a subfloor because you need to make it look like something other than concrete. Most shows, not all. Is that just something that would be of interest to you, or you could see doing something like that?
Yeah, most times, most subfloors, we let the tenant leave it.
Oh, really?
They don't even pull it up. Yeah.
Oh, well,
Yeah, that's my experience too. But it's also my experience, which is a good point that your guys are making, is that, the facilities that are out here, regardless of the size, do not have dedicated lockup space that can be used for that. Do not have construction shops where stuff could be left behind, like windows and door frames and things like that. It's all about clean it out and go away. There's the few separate construction shops that were around town. They tend to revolve between shows, and they get to do that, but not so much at the stages. And that's been one of my bones to pick with the stage facilities out here, is that they just don't. They make stages and offices and temporary space for sets, and that's it. And when a show's over, it's clean it out for the next guy.
Yeah. Just
we've
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, Warren, we've gone to great lengths to build proper mill shops, proper set deck storage facilities, proper wardrobe facilities, all set up for each individual department. Shot herself in the foot a little bit by doing that. The city's requirements change a lot when you do that, to going from film being temporary to now having to qualify for full cabinet making facilities. So it changes things a lot when you do build full-time facilities, as I've now found out. But yeah, with that infrastructure going in place, you're right, it can be left behind and be passed on from one show to the next. So.
Yeah. And Scott, just a point of clarification. You mentioned your design and clipping on like banana board, for example. Can you explain what banana board is, just for those out that there was a question in the chat. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page there.
Yeah, it's when construction gets together, to build all the flats, they actually staple the 1x4 onto banana board onto the 1x4. Yeah, I guess is how it should go. And so this is just more or less taking the place of that banana board that gets stapled on, to now having a quick attachable system that attaches to these metal frames.
So
But the
what
banana
is
board is
banana
effectively
board?
Luan.
Luan,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And that comes from Southeast Asia.
Yes,
So we're
pretty much. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
shipping it around the world. Yeah, and it's on every set,
Yes.
almost every set.
Yes.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be that way, by the way. Yeah. So in the US, you might hear it called Luan. Or banana board is just a fun nickname.
I mean, it doesn't have to be. I mean, that kind of gets into the sustainable materials thing, but it's also another reason why we should keep using things that we have built with all this wood from Southeast Asia. So
Yeah, exactly. Other question, Warren, and just, talking about this idea Joe had mentioned, about shipping materials down to LA and the cross-border, the IA cross-border problem or issue that you had mentioned. Do you know what the resolution for that was?
Yeah. I think generally speaking, the Labor Relations Department from everybody said, stop it.
Stop doing that?
Just stop, having this jurisdictional little hissy fit. You're sharing materials. Yeah. But it happened to me on one show where there was opposition to putting up flats that were built by another union local, but that got overcome pretty quickly.
Okay, so we're really sharing.
yeah, I mean, it used to be. I mean, we've talked about this, I think, on a previous call too. It's like it used to be what a decade ago, a decade and a half ago, where I never saw it happen, but maybe, Joe, maybe you did. Is like sets would be told to be cut up right after a show, so that that none of the flats or scenery could go to another show.
Yeah,
there were some coordinators who did that. Yes.
Okay,
not
so
a lot.
These are practices that when we recognize them, we should not be continuing them. Is that what I'm hearing?
That doesn't happen.
Yeah,
that doesn't happen anymore.
I don't think it happens anymore.
So anyway, there has been progress, but there needs to be.
Great, we're making progress here. And what I'm really loving about this conversation is we've got Warren, Daniel, and Tiffany on, who are like, you talk across. I mean, everybody talks across departments, but you've got this production lens in your roles. Do you feel that by having these kinds of conversations like this in this panel and talking to and learning about these different methodologies or, kind of what these issues might be, do you feel better equipped in your role to have maybe a deeper dialogue with your production designer or your construction manager or others on production about circularity? Do you feel like this is giving you a little more, I don't know, ammunition, if you will, to kind of press a little bit?
It shouldn't be a problem to talk about it from the get-go. The entire system is getting very familiar with it. I got started a long time ago with some of the sustainability stuff, and I see on our attendee list, there's Lisa Day is there, who has been involved for a long time. And it's just it comes down for production people to not be afraid to have these conversations with the people that might be hiring them. You could be a PM on a show and you're hiring a 5-time Academy Award winner production designer. Do you go up and have the conversation? Of course you do. But there are times when you get a little reserved about telling people or requesting people to do things a certain way, or at least lean in that direction. So the fear part should be gone. We've got a world that is challenged beyond description in terms of climate. We've got an industry that didn't believe it was bad for the environment for decades. And now we're all waking up going, holy shit, look what we're doing. And we're trying to overcome that from the office right through to construction through to transportation. So, because we are in such diverse parts of the country where power is generated different ways, all those things come to play. So it's having the conversation with all of our departments. I firmly believe that we should be having an environmental discussion, a sustainability discussion at the beginning of the show, the same way the legal departments have their anti-harassment discussions. You know, those things when we start a big show in the studio, send up or hire a local lawyer to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and harassment and all of that, and equality, all that stuff. You know, the sustainability shouldn't be a 5-minute add-on to that conversation. It should be, it should have its own time.
And it also really transcends waste. I think we've got, like, seems like most shows have got that down, whether it's the single water bottles or it's like where to put your different waste after the meals. It has to go way beyond that now, I think.
Yeah. So in thinking about, I'm just kind of pulling off some of the questions in the chat. I mean, we've all perhaps seen, heard, been creative with ways of producing. I mean, all the way from Tiffany's example on, using kits to capture interviews and whatnot, to Marion and Joe's reusable set examples. What about innovative materials that are just like, we're bringing materials on to set. That's a design and decision-making conversation. What materials do we bring onto set to either build with or use in other ways? I'm curious what your recommendations are or thoughts are on innovative materials or just reusable materials that can be used for various aspects, wherever you want to focus your answer.
Have you heard about vector sets?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's paper-based, right? Is it?
Yeah, they're
Compressed paper
paper-based.
and cardboard? Yeah.
A bit like, I've never used them, but they're a bit like what Scott was describing in terms of his aluminum frame thing.
Right.
I think from my understanding, they mostly do. I've looked at their websites and things like that, and it like for smaller sets or for commercials and stuff, I think it's quite good. So it potentially is a solution. And there was a company in the company that produced those those paper panels, paper composite panels I mentioned in the setup, the picture of. That company is based in Tillsonburg and Ontario, and they've come up. They create all sorts of systems similar to Vector Sets, or whatever that company's called named, and they provide booths for industrial shows and things like that. And Joe is working with the owner of that company, trying to come up with a connecting system and stuff. But the seams, because it was paper, the seams were a problem, from what I understand you saying, Joe. But just before you describe it more, Joe, is just going back to the panels that I used on that ceiling set. It was fantastic, like 95% recycled paper. And it's a kind of material that can be used for signage, or like I used it for ceiling pieces. There are materials out there, and part of it is incumbent on us to approach our suppliers and say, do you have a sustainable option, whether it's vinyl or whether it's ink printing or whether it's wood. And yes, I had a quick look at the questions. Yes, some of these materials are more expensive. It's true, but then it'll come back to like, what's the carbon footprint of these things? And that is going to have a quotient.
Right.
So you're the one who buys materials more. It's recycled paint though. I like using recycled paint, and there's lots of that out there too.
Yeah, my issue with some of the sustainable materials I've tried with the gentleman as well is the seams. And to get a smooth seam, the scenics have to plaster it so wide that it starts to make it not so reusable is the problem. and it doesn't hold up. I had found, but the paper product that you're talking about, that is a great find, and we use that whenever we can as well, because it's not only that's light, it's lighter. It's like a third of the cost of Gator foam, and it works. And it's, what'd you say? I think 95% recyclable, right?
And
Yeah.
95%, yeah. And it comes in 4x10 sheets, so it comes oversized a bit too. But anyway, I mean, going back to the example I had, it was only available 2 years ago out of Tellsonburg, like they had to ship it, which seemed like, well, that's a drag. But in fact, it was still cheaper and more sustainable than what I could find locally. So in some cases, that's, you have to kind of weigh those.
Okay.
All right. So it sounds like I've kind of noted a few things that have been said throughout, and I'll get to kind of a roundup kind of in a little while. But I just want to go back to this idea that has come up a couple of times um, of um, being resourceful, having, working on productions that might have smaller budgets, um, and being resourceful, using your materials responsibly, as not to waste as much. I'd like to dig into that just a little bit because I think that I've heard, and maybe you have as well, the question of, well, we are a smaller production. We don't have the budget, the luxury, if you will, to think about reuse and think about, buying, innovative or interesting or different material or whatever the case is, because we don't have that budget. Can we speak? Maybe Mary and Joe or whoever has perspective on this, think about or speak to this idea of, being resourceful in smaller budgets and how much you can actually do with less, like smaller budget shows and
I think it's
and reusing material.
As Tiffany described, even on Jane, and I think from your documentary background, but actually having not much money kind of puts you at the head of the curve, to be honest, because you're just having to do it to save money. And as I described in terms of my own practice, is like trying to get a good look with not much money. So I'd be like looking for like really interesting things to maybe build a design around. So in fact, I think it's the lower budget ones. They don't have the budget to hire a sustainability advisor and put that in place. But actually, I think they're a little more nimble in terms of adjusting and being that's my feeling. And again, I can only speak from my own experience, but that's just my observation and my own feeling. But anyone else can weigh in on that. It's the bigger shows that I feel maybe when they're building more big sets, and 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 it takes a huge amount of coordination and the real machine going, that maybe that's where it's harder. But I think Joe,
I wanted to chime in on one of your earlier questions around kind of like how this conversation has influenced it. I think as a director, and sometimes we can have some influence on our producers, and or at least chime in or be asked of like, who do you want to work with? But I would say at the most part around this dialogue around like how do you have these conversations and the fear around bringing something like this up. I often find that conversations like this are more helpful when you have like when they're like solution based. So it's not just like bringing up a problem, but it's actually coming up with some ideas. And I think what this conversation has kind of given me some thoughts around is like, there's a lot of knowledge here, and a lot of knowledge here that I would say maybe across the board, not many people in like maybe in the producer or exec positions may not are privy or just don't care, or they're just not flooded with that type of knowledge or background. And I just feel like there is, for me, bringing it back, thinking about this other project that I'm being brought into as a director for a feature and potentially shot in North Bay. Um, I know that it's more effective thinking about solutions, bringing up ideas, and not just asking, have you guys thought about these things? Because I know the answer is no, or not really, or like we have a budget, we have time, money, all of that stuff. But I like the idea of, have you guys thought about this? And maybe here are some ideas, and I think that that type of way of engaging, production and everyone, kind of associated to making these changes and decisions, like kind of can lead to like actual steps of like making a different choice in terms of hiring, as well as kind of choice of materials, as well as do we go on location and how do we, for me, like the doc background has informed a lot of ways I shoot with like natural light. Frankly, the irony of like trying to recreate reality when it's like, you know what, I really love shooting with natural light, and I feel like I do that best on location, and how I do that, yeah, might cause a little bit of, stress with everybody, to not be in studio. But yeah, there's certain preferences of things that I've adopted that based on the fact that I just don't have the resources to build an entire world, inside a studio. So
Mm.
yeah.
No, that's interesting. So Marion, you've kind of mentioned how you approach these conversations. I mean, can you give us an example of, you said, um, on one of your last shows, you started off with saying, here's kind of how I'm coming in thinking about this. Is that how you typically do it, or what have you found has been the best way to start a conversation about circularity, or how you would like to approach it?
I don't ask if everyone wants to do it. I just say, let's try to do this. Like, it's kind of like, that's kind of, I think, how I approach it. Is like, this is like we need to be more sustainable. Who's on board, or let's try to do this. And then each department, like, of course, how do you think you can do it? And how do you think you can do it? Like, and going back to the case study I presented, I'm not I've been around construction a lot, but I'm not a construction coordinator, so I can't tell them what to do, but I can engage them and get them to, contribute what they would know. So I think that's what you have to do, is you have to rely on the expertise of your team, for sure. And we're all, in this panel, we all have different expertises. So, but I think going back to that initial conversation is, what can we all do to raise the bar on sustainability on our production? And yes, going back to, I mean, bigger picture, macro picture, what Daniel was saying, yeah, incentives. I mean, that would help. Having those kind of things in place would I think help push this forward as well. But in terms of myself, it's like, again, you have to rely on the people that you're working with to bring their sustainable game as well. You can help give some suggestions, or you can brainstorm and things like that. But again, like anything, whether it's achieving the look of the film, just generally not sustainably minded at all, like a director or producer, we all have to rely on the expertise of the people around us, right? So same with sustainability. So it's just engaging in the conversation. How do we do this?
Mhm. And Joe, do you have any particular tips from the construction department on how to engage the department on, you know, how to build um, for deconstruction, or build so that it can be used modularly? How do folks approach that conversation in construction?
Uh, well, it's usually me that brings it up and say, let's look at this a way of, because I'd like to try and reuse some of this, or if not all of it, right, or part of it. I think I think Tiffany's right. It's starting to either offer up your own solutions or starting to ask for solutions. And as Daniel said, we're storytellers, and when that story takes a wild turn for the left, we don't all say we can't do that. We start jumping in with, we're all asking questions. What do you need? What if I did this? What if we all start offering solutions? So I think it's just to get that conversation going at the beginning.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, because we're a problem solving industry anyway, right? No matter what. So we can certainly problem solve around this.
We're an industry that's used to saying yes. So
And I think I mean, what's been brought up quite often in these kind of conversations is how quickly the industry figured out how to deal with the whole pandemic guidelines, like just on a dime practically, like, less than what, like from March until August. By August, a lot of productions were back on their feet, and people just adhered to the guidelines. And is it because it was kind of a life and death situation? Well, we're kind of there now too. You just wait till the forest fires start this summer, and we'll feel even more so. So anyways, it's just, I mean, again, there's so much talent in our industry for solving problems, and we do it all the time. And we did it miraculously, I think, in 2020. So it just doesn't seem like this should be that hard. And you're just tapping into where the will is most, I guess, lively.
Totally. Well, let's just do a quick wrap up, and maybe share some final thoughts, each of you, kind of, maybe what part of this conversation has inspired you, what you might take back, or, just any parting thoughts that you might have for the many people who have joined us here today. And then after we go through your wrap up, I'll just give a few action items, if you will, a few points for consideration that people can do on their next production. And then Marion, I want to end with you and maybe Maura telling us a little bit more about that calculator that you mentioned earlier. So
Um,
why don't we do that?
Yeah, are we just gonna? There's a lot of questions I think in there, and are we gonna address those too?
Did we not?
I haven't been
See.
looking. I've just been glancing. I see
Some were comments I noticed. I haven't read every single one, I have to be honest. Some were comments. We talked a bit
There are a couple at the
about
top. If you'd like me to look at if it's easier, I can. You could tell me if these questions have come up yet. But there was a question for
okay.
Warren and Dan. I don't know if
Okay,
that
go
can be
for it.
read.
I don't see.
Using Sync on Set on your shows, do you have your departments properly input everything so that the Asset Hub program can be used to properly flag items for direct recycle, for sale, etc.? I think Dan, were you gonna answer? Sure.
Sure. Or Warren, go ahead.
Well, sync on set doesn't get always used. I think some productions, the people that are, because you can get 5 departments on it, I think, for one price. And I don't think the inputting is effectively done. And I've seen that in a couple of situations where everything that could be inputted isn't. But when it is, you certainly do have a very good overview of what you can reuse, dispose, or sell. So I think it's a very good asset that more shows should use. It's not universally used from my point of view. I don't know what you see from your angle, Danny.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it's not currently used that way, or at least not pervasively. I think part of the reason for that is that, if what we're talking about here is having a place for these things to go, like, sure, we try to recycle, but like for something like sets, flats, and so on, I think the biggest thing we lack is where is a place for those things to go, even if they're noted in sync on set. But I think it's a good point in that, we will, if we actually find a place for those sets to go, we'll need a way to track them. And that seems like a good tool to do it with. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Another question?
Yep, there's
There
another
you
one,
are.
and I think it's for whomever wants to read it. If you've read it before, Zena, let me know. I just don't want to repeat anything, but I don't believe this one it was read.
Okay.
The chat. When sourcing materials for the art department, recycled or more eco-friendly materials are usually more expensive than regular or synthetic ones. As you said, Marion, people only care that it doesn't cost more. How can we justify this added cost to art directors and producers whose priority is doing things as cheaply as possible?
Well, I had seen that question earlier, and I kind of just quickly mentioned it. I think that's where, like, the carbon footprint quotient will come into play. It isn't right now, even though I think some films, like telefilm film and CBC films, I think are required to do the Albert or something like that, to do the carbon footprint. So again, going back to what Daniel said about, like, we do need some sort of governmental guidelines to sort of, so that the bar gets raised. Anyways, that's sort of the longer term answer to what that person was asking. In the short term, you can just as Clara George to quote her, she goes, as sustainable as possible. That's what we can do. And so whether it's recycled paint, because another show is getting rid of 5-gallon pails of it, or there's a couple lines out there that are sustainable, but they actually are much cheaper. They're like at $20 a gallon for loop paint versus maybe $60 a gallon. So there are some products out there that aren't more expensive. Joe, you can talk more to like the woods and things like that. And yes, they're more expensive, but I think again we have to think of the larger picture. And again, the reuse quotient has to be woven into this, because, like, is it brand new? Are we taking it new off the shelf, or are we trying to make use of something that already exists in the world. And we're just trying to like give it a new home, which goes back to what Daniel said, the sustainable asset depot or lockup is definitely something we need to look at too.
Yeah. And I see a question about transportation. That wasn't the main topic of this one, but we could certainly like quickly touch on that. Um, any thoughts on how transportation is addressing
Yeah, I mean,
sustainability?
transportation's a really good way to see how there's so many layers to this. Like it could go all the way to the script stage, right? Like a story that is set in one location is gonna have a lower carbon footprint than one with 50 different locations. And so, there's that, there's technology. I'd love to see a fleet of electric cars available, especially for film. I think that would be an amazing initiative, that maybe there could be some sort of partnership with some of the rental companies that would create a program like that. And then just, adjacent to transportation, generators, that technology is out there. It's in the vendors have battery powered generators rather than diesel, ready to go. There's an expense issue. And just going back to the question about costs of materials, et cetera, if you look at the climate debate that's been going on for decades, there's a case often made that it is more economic to be sustainable. And that is true when you look at the long term, like you're saying, Marion. Like, so if you're looking at the long term, it is more economic, but the problem is our entire culture is very short term oriented, and our industry in particular is even more short term oriented. And so in a way, it's a microcosm for the challenge of the climate movement overall. And what I've learned from being in that climate movement in different areas, you need to build a coalition. It's government, industry, unions, individuals of goodwill, like the folks here. But no one of those groups can do it on their own. So I really think it's about making those connections, and putting plans in place that we all can see a mutual interest in. And that's where I'd love to see these conversations go, is in building those coalitions.
Totally. Totally. All right. Then just to wrap us up, a few actions that I noted as we've been talking through that I think, we can all do or get or continue to practice if we are doing them, is dialogue. Dialogue on production seems to be key. That we've mentioned it several times. Practice doing that more, and plan your exit plan in prep. That was mentioned also, and come with solutions. Right. That seems to be very important to get to the next step in decision making. And also kind of more from the practical perspective that sets can be modular, and reused material is interesting and can be used. So seek it out, even down to recycled paint. That's a great one, Marion. Seek out that material. Another thing is creativity. I know it was mentioned a few times. We had a creative solution for this or that. So creativity is key. Take what you've learned from your previous production and apply it to the next one. And we just keep building, practicing over and over, and getting that much better, and working towards sustainability that much more. Similarly, that thinking in a problem-solving manner around sustainability, that's come up several times, and I think that that's key. We can all do that right now. And this idea of resourcefulness, even lessons learned from lower budget productions and their ability to be resourceful, can be applied across the board. And then Daniel, your point about building a coalition, noted that we can all work toward that, use our voices to engage various stakeholders within this. Maybe you're part of a committee already, but continue to use your voice and engage municipalities, suppliers, studios, reuse organizations, to work toward some of these solutions that we all want. We can continue to have those conversations now. So those were a few that I noted. If anybody has any others they want to just quickly share, please feel free. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Mara and Marion to tell us a little bit more about that calculator.
Thank you so much,
So
Zainab.
Mara, why don't you present it? You've got the graphic and all that.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm going to show everyone just an example of what we're developing. We're finalizing the calculator as we speak, so it should be ready in the coming weeks. I just want to thank Marion and Joe for all of their direction while we were making this. I mean, where the DGC is obviously working to become more familiar with the work that needs to be done in the areas of sustainability, but to be able to build a list of materials and to be able to understand what the carbon emissions are. I mean, I learned a lot just working on this project, but I'm so happy to have had Marion and Joe kind of help direct me and put me in touch with the right organizations to put this together. So what it is, I'm just going to present it. I'll see if everyone can see it in a second. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So what it is, it's a carbon emissions calculator. So it allows the user to understand the carbon emissions resulting from the specific material. So what we did was we broke it down into different categories, and this is something that's obviously in evolution. So we can continue to add different materials to this, but it's separated by category. So as you can see here, we've got materials under plastic, metal, glass, concrete, wood, and then metal and plastic and chemicals. And so under all of these categories, you can select what you're using on set. And each one has a different, obviously, carbon emissions factor. And so what you can go into here and do and select, for example, what you're using, the pounds or the units that you're using. And you can choose the number here, obviously, depending on how many, and it automatically puts the unit that's associated with this, with whichever piece. And so you can select it here. And again, we continue to build this as we understand what materials are being used on set. But what it'll do is it'll allow you to understand what the carbon emissions are, and will give you the total resulting of the set of materials that you've used. So it'll help you make better decisions in terms of what you're using on set, but it'll help you also understand the impact of those materials you're choosing to use in your productions. So I think it's a very good educational tool. The idea is to be able to generate as many materials as we are familiar with or as possible that are being used on sets. And so if anyone has any questions or suggestions, I'm happy to get on a call or have a conversation about it. And we want to also be able to help to make this tool evolve and make it as comprehensive as possible. So we're very open to feedback. We're hoping to launch it in the coming weeks and hold the meeting or a workshop specifically just to kind of guide people through this tool. I think it's important to see the impact of what you do. And I think a lot of the conversations that happen around, um, the environmental crises that we're seeing is that it's not immediately identifiable or it's not visible right away. And so a lot of us just make the assumption that things are not going wrong because we can't see it. So I think having a numerical proof of something is helpful. Having evidence of what can happen as a result of selecting certain materials or sourcing certain materials is a huge way to put that into perspective. And it's a very important way to educate people in the industry about the impact of certain materials on set. So we're hoping that this is something that members can use. It's also going to be available on our website on dgcgreen.ca, but we'll also share it within the members and obviously within the industry to the industry counterparts, so they know that this exists as well.
And just further to that, like further down the line, won't be in this first iteration, but there's been discussion about building in some kind of like tracking quotient for the wrap and prep thing. So it kind of touches on what was talked about earlier.
Mm.
And also I think what comes up obviously is the question, if you do end up using assets from somewhere else, do you still are you still obliged to do this, or has that already been accounted for? So I mean, there's a lot of like granular stuff that would have to be worked out, but I think it's still a great, just as you said, Mara, like an educational tool to sort of look at this and go, wow, I knew that like one bedroom set or that like mansion or whatever it is you built that's what the carbon footprint is for it. And just kind of anecdotal to that is, I don't know how many of you out there use Scriptation, but I use it, and they actually send out a little metrics thing I got it this morning for like how much I'd personally saved in Scriptation, and really in 2023 I didn't work much, but I still saved. What did I say? I saved 42.1 pounds of carbon and 50 gallons of water and 2.7 of pounds of waste. So like the metrics are being sent out even on like, scriptation, which is the tool where you don't have to print anything. So anyway, just as an example of how these kind of things are part of the conversation, is what does the carbon footprint?
Is there an opportunity if you run through this calculator for a production and you list all the materials that you're using and the quantities that you're using and you come out with a carbon footprint? Is there an opportunity when you get that number to say this equals 5 hectares of boreal forest? Is there something like that to say this is the equivalent of this?
So from a developer's perspective, yes, it's doable. And it's actually one of the first suggestions we had on this calculator, is to show what that impact looks like in a different form.
Right.
How many tons or how many kilograms of waste that would be. So that's something we want to be able to implement in it as well.
Yeah,
I think it is
the
helpful.
Trees Canada website does that very simply in a way, because you can put in, I think, mileage or whatever, and then it will tell you how many trees need to be planted to offset that. So something along that line. So there's a graphic, illustration, because carbon footprint, it's a thing, it's in the air, but nobody really understands it until they see it quantified in another way.
I would love if you
Great.
can share this website with me. I would.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much for your contribution, your perspective, and really appreciate you sharing and helping us all learn a little bit more about circularity in this industry